All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Screenwalks. My name is Marco Demutis. I'm digital curator at Fotomuseum Winterthur in Switzerland. Screenwalks is a collaborative program initiated by the Photographers Gallery in London and Fotomuseum Winterthur with support by Pro Helvetia. The series of fortnightly live-streamed events was created as a joint effort by both institutions to continue the investigation on the changing role of photography in its digital and network forms. Every Screenwalk is led by one or more artists, curators, or researchers, performing guided explorations of the places where their core practice takes place. Every event has a different format and a different pace, and every invited participant is asked to play with the possibilities of these live streams. If this is your first ever Screenwalk, please make sure to visit our website, screenwalks.com, to check the recordings of all of our previous events. Today, our platform infrastructure is different, as we are attempting to reflect on the topics of today's Screenwalk by integrating them in our setup. We'll learn what these notions and implications are in a moment, but this experimentation comes with some instability and just in general some adjusting that is needed. So you might take a moment to get familiar with this interface, find where the chat is, and look at how to activate or deactivate your camera. Everything should be rather familiar, but just in case, take a couple of moments. Your microphone should be muted. If not, go ahead and mute it now. This event is being recorded and will be archived, so please turn off your camera if you do not want to be recorded. Feel free to send questions to John or me privately or in the public chat throughout the event. Finally, in case of technical issues, I also want to remind everyone that we still have the Screenwalk streaming to our Twitch channel, and you can always see it live on screenwalks.com.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us from my side, too. I'm John Uriarte, curator of digital programs at the Photographers Gallery here in London. If this is not your first Screenwalk, as my colleague Marco has mentioned, you might have realized that we are not in Zoom tonight. We are using Big Blue Button instead, an open source software, along with the technical assistance of the online meeting cooperative, a tech cooperative using open source whose servers run on renewable energy, who explicitly don't share or exploit user data, who are self-organized as a cooperative and shaped as an open community. The suggestion to hire the services of this cooperative and use Big Blue Button was given by our guests, Aymeric Mansoux and Roel Roscam Abbing. They both are part of the community, researching and actively working with the alternative social media platforms, and they will be sharing their knowledge and insights about it with all of us today. And the lockdown digitized most of our social interactions, making us even more aware of the lack of online autonomy when trying to avoid platforms that are not aligned with our own ethical and political views. Those platforms' images not only take over the visual surface, they also represent most of the online traffic, shaping the development of profit-driven infrastructures. Both Aymeric and Roel have been thinking and working around the opportunities and challenges of running self-managed online services and network infrastructures, and they will share 3 case studies with us today. The first one is Lurk, a small collective of artists and hackers interested in facilitating and archiving discussions around net and computational cultural politics. Lumbung Space, an experiment to create an online environment where artistic practices rooted in diversity, solidarity, and commoning can come together. And NextPath, which is the experimental publishing master at the Piet Zwart Institute, Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam, and Masters of Arts and Fine Art and Design, focused on the acts of making things public and creating publics in the age of post-digital networks. These 3 projects attend to self-host and self-manage alternative online platforms and tools. We consider not using Zoom for this event today as an attempt in the same direction, which will help us learn what does it involve to host an online event avoiding corporate online platforms. Aymeric Mansoux was a founding member of server-based collective Go210, and other recent collaborations include the Score Codex, which is an archive about the impossibility of archiving What Remains, an 8-bit video game about the manipulation of public opinion and whistleblowing for the NES, and Lurk, the server infrastructure for discussions around net and computational art and culture and politics that I mentioned. Aymeric received his PhD from the Center of Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths University in London for his investigation of the legal forms of social organization within free and open source-based cultural practices, and currently runs the experimental publishing master course XPath. Roel Roscam Abbing, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name again, is currently a PhD candidate at Malmö University Department of Interaction Design, and there he researches alternative social media, online federation, and community-owned digital infrastructures. Furthermore, he works as an artist and designer with a practice engaged with network infrastructures, the politics of technology, and do-it-yourself approaches. Aymeric and Roel, thank you for accepting our invitation to the ScreenWorks, and thank you also for helping to organize it and coordinate it. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Before we start, I'm seeing a couple of messages in the chat that people are having trouble with the audio, and some of them seem to have found a way to make it work. So maybe we take just one, to the risk of delaying things, we take 1 or 2 minutes to figure out if people get to have audio. Otherwise, they have to go to the Twitch platform. So for instance, I've seen that Winnie mentioned that you have to click on the blue button. So does it work? Maybe someone can say something. If any of the presenter, for instance, I don't know, Winnie, if you are still around, okay. So the audio is working fine for all. Okay. Just to make sure that there might be some compatibility issues, and if you have compatibility issues, then you may need to use a browser that is recent enough, a recent version of Firefox or Chrome or Chromium. Otherwise, maybe someone can paste the URL for the Twitch. Yes, super. Thanks, Sam. So those who are struggling with the audio, and right. So I'm going to type it. If you are struggling with the audio, please go to the Twitch URL. So I think that's probably what we can do as a sort of a workaround for now. So for those who can make it work, I mean, try to enable it through the interface. There should be like an blue audio button that allows you to turn the audio on, and that allows you to hear what we're going to say. Otherwise, fear not, just go to the Twitch URL, and then you can see exactly what we're going to do here. And I believe that someone is going to keep an eye also on the chat of Twitch, so that if you also have questions, you can use the Twitch chat as well. Okay, sorry for this glitch. So we're going to start. And I think that's actually a very fitting introduction, because this is not easy to do things differently. It's not easy to adopt a different workflow, different platform. And I'm very, very thankful to our host tonight to go through this this sort of baptism of fire, in a way, to try to engage with different software, to start to kind of step out of the classic Zoom or MS Teams or Skype environment that we use by default most of the time. So this also is a bit of a meta presentation in the sense, because we're trying to also put money where my mouth is in this particular case. But it also addresses an important point, which is that when we're talking about discussion about media in general, whether it's like networked images or network media in general, there is often a belief that this exists in a vacuum somehow. There is discussion and engagement about the aesthetics it generates, about the discourses it can create, but rarely there is a sort of a step beyond this boundary to engage with infrastructures with these things are being made possible, and this circulation of media online. So in a way, tonight is a slightly footnote to the series of the Screenworks, but I think this is an important footnote because it's going to talk about the infrastructure through which all these things are possible or should be criticized or scrutinized. So it's going to be a little bit more technical probably than other presentations. So you have to bear with us and stick with us. We're going to try to simplify things, but it is important to address every now and then these things. So without further ado, I'm going to finally start the presentation with Roel. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. All right. And then I'm going to turn off my camera. And here we go. Roel, can you confirm that you can see the screen?
Beautiful purple screen.
This is great. This is it. Okay, so let's start. I think first of all we need to quickly explain what is this context. And this context for us, I'm going to take some shortcut, but I think it's important to talk about our relationship with the computer industry. So the way we often picture ourselves is when we are part of a field, let's say a sector or a trade, or it's a community of practice. We do have, let's say, tools at our disposal, or environment, or framework. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but we have things that are somehow part of the sort of productive apparatus that make the community of practice that we form. And this is how we often relate to computer technology, that we see first this sort of this field or sector. Again, like you can pick whatever term is the most, let's say, that resonates the most with your background. It doesn't really matter. So that's pretty much how we see things. And then sometimes you have, of course, overlap of tools between different sectors or different fields. But what we've seen in the past years with the rise of the computer tech industry is that this is not exactly matching the reality, which is a little bit more like this, where all these tools and environment and framework have been slowly turned into platforms. Even the most basic utility or application these days comes with a lot of connectivity, a lot of backend, a lot of user tracking. So we are really engaging with another type of tools. And this is within these platforms that we are essentially having different community of practices. So the question is not whether or not one is better than the other, because in some situation, the platformization of certain practices can be super empowering and super interesting. And I'm getting spam now. The problem is more like we don't necessarily, or actually we don't really have the choice. So what is happening is that in this transformation, there is different ways, let's say, to frame it. There has been a lot of writing about it. There is all sorts of different concepts that can articulate this different of capture. It doesn't really matter, again, what kind of theoretical framework you want to use to describe it. At the end of the day, the same phenomenon is happening, which is a sort of increasing sharecropping of our practices. So we are not so much right now in a sort of deficit of theory or critique to understand this phenomenon, but we are definitely in a deficit of practices who can respond to that, or at least that can try to reestablish a balance between these two different approaches that we can have with computer technology. And so one way that we can see that this conflation is creating, let's say, difficulty to address the problem is with how we relate to these tools. So let's take for instance like Facebook. If we take social media as an example of the consequences of having this sort of platformization and this sort of alienation towards our own instruments somehow. Let's take Facebook. The question is really, what is Facebook? And if you ask different people, you may have different answers. So for some, Facebook is going to be a collection of users. For others, Facebook is a type of administration of social media. Oopla. Can't write. For others, Facebook is essentially a software stack. But it can also be a data center. It's also a domain name. It can be also an economic model. And it can also be, let's say, a system that relates to environmental and resources in a certain way. So when we talk about Facebook, for instance, or when we talk about social media, particularly from this branding and corporate perspective, it becomes almost like ubique. It's ubiquitous in the sense we don't really know what it is. And because it's difficult to address it, it makes it even more difficult to relate to this transformation that I was mentioning just here. So what happens, however, is that as a first step, we need to find a way to break apart these things. And this is where it starts to get interesting, because then we realize that users, the concept of users, is in itself a certain topic. Then the administration is another one. And then software. And then data center. Or even hosting to some extent. And the domain, the economic model, and the sort of relationship with environmental resources. This is important to do because even though that sounds a little bit complicated, that's the first step that needs to be done if we want to have this discussion, to start to break apart this sort of computer technology that basically are surrounding us in our practice nowadays, to really see what it is that we are talking about. Because if we're going to talk about alternative, what is it exactly that we are going to talk about? Are we talking about alternative ways of rating with, like the governance in a system? Are we talking about alternative software? So we could have Facebook, but as free software, so therefore it could be better. Are we talking about self-hosting Facebook? Are we talking about different type of domain? So essentially, when we want to engage with these questions of alternative, we need to go through this unpacking to be more specific about what is exactly the problem with this different environment and what are the options. And then this is very challenging, of course, because as you realize very quickly, the answers to these questions become overwhelming. The number of options to then tackle these different things is going to explode. This is going to grow exponentially. So it's a little bit difficult, but this is a necessary step to be able to understand what is it that we are talking about. So essentially, when we are talking about these questions of alternative, we have to figure out what it is that we are talking about and what kind of scale we are working on.
Is this my cue, Aymeric?
It is your cue.
Yes.
Go.
Good. Thank you so much. So, when we talk about alternatives, in a way, the discussion appears usually in two levels. And so the first one is this idea of kind of a drop-in replacement for existing services. So to give an example, that's the idea that instead of outsourcing all of your email correspondence to Google with Gmail, you would use other email infrastructure instead. And that's really the kind of the traditional free and open software position and discourse on alternatives. So it's the production of the same but different software. So it's the same, it does the same things, yet it's based on open source and free software. Another idea is to think of alternatives as engaging with technology in a wholly different way altogether. And so that relates to discussions of software as a tool versus software as a culture, for example. And in a way, that's a different discussion that can be had, and it's more of a kind of systemic discussion, whereas one is maybe catering to kind of immediate needs, the other one is trying to do kind of longer term shifts and changes of relations. So to explain a bit this axis between drop-in replacements and systemic shifts, and to link it a bit back to cultural practices, you can imagine the problem by thinking of the metaphor of organizing a room for an event, and thinking of, let's say, the table and chair arrangements of your speakers. So imagine on the one hand a room where the speaker stands and the audience is sitting on the chairs in front. Everything is neatly arranged in rows. Aymeric is drawing the speaker on one side, audience on the other side. There's multiple rows there. And that's a pretty standard setup. And some of you that already have experience with hosting events will think, well, actually, that's nice, but the half circle is much nicer because it gets as many people as close to the speaker as possible. And also, we could also change different seats. You know, we could go instead for these kind of stiff seats. We could go for more kind of nice comfy pillows or whatever. And that's a bit the idea of the drop-in replacement of alternatives. So you switch out the one chair for the other one. It's in a way relatively straightforward, but it leaves many things the same. And although that's not necessarily problematic, it is also just that. So the idea of thinking of more systemic shifts, or the idea of thinking in alternatives, is that you have the intuition that you need to change the arrangement of chairs because you know that this will create entirely different situations. For example, what if you set everybody up in a circle? Or what if you do small groups with multiple speakers, for example? Or what if there are no chairs at all? So you intuitively, you know that these will create really different situations, but at the same time, you know that you cannot just rearrange the chairs because the social dynamics will not immediately change with them. And so it's also important to realize that these situations need to have some kind of form of active facilitation as well. So how do you make sure, for example, that everybody is welcome and knows what to do? So that requires a kind of learning certain new skills of facilitating, and it also requires unlearning others. And I think this metaphor is to say that the idea of thinking alternatives in terms of digital infrastructure is somewhat similar. It produces different relations, but exactly which ones? And it should stress the role that both facilitation, so this mode of different alternatives requiring also different practices requires, and that there are also somehow different questions which kind of sit at on a spectrum of what we can consider to be alternatives. At the same time, we can also consider that they might work really differently on different scales. So, for example, very small scale initiatives. So if we have the scale of systemic shifts versus drop-in replacements on the one hand, and kind of small scale and large scale on the other hand, one can imagine that small scale initiatives can be much more radical and can get much more done. But on the other hand, larger scale initiatives have more resources to kind of make the work more permanent. So they're in a way kind of different inflections of the same question. So these different the the different case studies that we will talk about today, so Lurk, Loomboom.space, and XPub, we're going to conveniently plot them out against these different scales of, on the one hand, kind of systemic shifts versus drop-in replacements. And on the other hand, whether it's a kind of a larger scale initiative or a smaller scale initiative, because it kind of changes a bit what they're doing and what they're able to do in a way. And that is not to say that one is better than the other, but it's just really to give you a kind of idea of, like, yeah, what kind of scale of initiative is it? What kind of resources are available? What are the intentions there? And so we're going to start off with Lurk.org, which is it's a really small scale initiative, and it's kind of in between the drop-in replacement, but also trying to do some kind of systemic shifts. On the other hand, we will also talk about Loomboom.space, which is a kind of a bit larger scale initiative, which is doing much more the kind of work of finding replacements, but with different kind of resource allocation than Loomboom.space. And finally, we're going to be talking about the experimental publishing program of the Piet Zwart, which is a kind of, in terms of resources, it's a larger scale initiative, and it's doing really kind of the work of the reconfiguring of the relations towards technologies. And so to talk about Lurk, the first one.
Whoops.
Many tabs.
Hopla.
Yes. So this is the webpage of Lurk.org. And as it was already mentioned, Lurk.org is a initiative that both me and Aymeric are part of. And what we do is we host software that cultural producers like us can use. So like the issue of alternatives or like systemic shift alternatives versus drop-in replacements, historically, Lurk has followed two kinds of paths in a way. One of that was a kind of a response to urgent matters, and the other kind of path that Lurk has followed has been an initiative to kind of create new spaces. So to just give you a kind of idea of the things we've been doing, Lurk started out in 2015, and it started by hosting a system of mailing lists to basically prevent the ongoing leakage of mailing list culture that was happening at the time to closed Facebook groups. So one of the things that you had at the time is that a lot of kind of cultural organizations, communities of practice had their practices happening much more and more on closed Facebook group, which basically meant that the archive of these practices was disappearing and that they were basically requiring a Facebook account. And so it started off really as a kind of drop-in replacement for these kinds of practices. And currently there are around 50 lists in various states of activity or inactivity, as mailing lists usually are. A lot of them are also private lists, so for closed to the public and for smaller collectives. And so that's an example of something which is really kind of a drop-in replacement practice. On the other hand, in 2016, Lurk started hosting chat-based software that was working on a federated protocol. And this came out of sessions that we had been running with the Homebrew Server Club, which were really about understanding how all of this worked, how we could host it ourselves, and what kind of things could be done with it. And we didn't really have a direct need for it, but it was really for us learning how to use it and seeing a bit what the potential was in these alternatives. And currently it's used mostly for interpersonal chat, but there are also a few kind of public discussion rooms in it. And one of the interesting things that Aymeric is showing you is that there are different applications that can be used to access the same kind of chat group. So that's kind of different from, for example, WhatsApp, where you cannot you cannot interconnect your WhatsApp Messenger and your Facebook Messenger, for example, even though they're the same company. Another example of one of the things that Lurk did. Here's the same chat from our web interface, and this is a community for hardware modding. So in 2017, is the chat? Yes. In 2017, one of the founders of Lurk, Alex McLean, did a relatively unilateral action of moving the chats from the live coding community TopLab, which were based on Slack, to a self-hosted alternative on lurk.org. And that was really in response to a kind of slippage that was happening. Alex is one of the initiators of the entire live coding scene, and also very aware of the importance of environment and tooling for that scene. And the problem with Slack is that the community started relying more and more on it, and that essentially Slack's business model is that they rent back your own archive back to you. So, which in the case of cultural practices tends to mean kind of loss of knowledge, a loss of legacy, a loss of culture. And so there was a kind of urgency to move to another system. And because Alex, was one of the initiators of this entire scene, he basically, in a digital sense, packed his bag and moved everything to another system, where currently the TopLab chat and forum resides. So all the kind of technical questions, but also archives of particular tracks that have been made, and these kinds of things all reside within this kind of self-managed environment now. To give you another idea of one of the things we do with lurk.org is from 2018. Out of our prior interests in these federated protocols from the chat, we decided to try out installing this new software, which was called Mastodon, and to give alternative social media another try. There was no real plan with doing this, but it actually, in the end, it ended up forming one of the more interesting and active communities around lurk.org. So currently, it's based on invitation only. So if you know somebody on lurk.org, they can invite you in, or you can talk to us. And the people that joined were friends or friends of friends. But we've also gotten to know more people through it. And it's really one of the more active parts of the lurk.org. And importantly, this network, it's not an island, but everybody that is on post.lurk.org can also communicate with others on similar kind of social media servers elsewhere. So it's kind of networking these kind of niche communities together. And we still don't really know what post.lurk.org is or does, or where we want to go with it. But we do know that it's interesting and it's really valuable to keep around, because we're making actually valuable kind of cultural connections through it. So that's a bit kind of an idea of what we do. But then the question is also like, how does that look technically? What is the hardware, and what kind of servers do we have there? So maybe that's the next image that Aymeric can prepare. So
we have to do it a bit quick.
Yes. So very briefly, Lurk is tiny. We're 4 people. So it's Alex, I already mentioned. Then there's Lydia. There's Aymeric, and then there's me, Roel. And we kind of work on these on Lurk as a kind of a hobby volunteer basis, and we're looking for ways to make it sustainable currently. But with the 4 of us, we manage 3 different machines. One which is called Agnes. One which is called Vrijdagmiddagborrel, or VMB. and one which is called skattkista, which is Swedish for treasure chest. And with these machines, they run all our different services. So for example, on Agnes, we have our XMPP chat and we have our mailing lists. On VMB, we're running our Mastodon instance, so post.lurk.org. Then, of course, everything needs to have an IceCast streaming server, and maybe some other things I'm forgetting now. Everything needs to have backups, of course. So that's what we have, secret stuff. That's what we have skattkista for. So that's a machine which we just use for offsite backups. And of course, these machines don't pop out of thin air, but they're actually connected to other initiatives. So for example, Agnes is provided to us by servus.at, which is an Austrian kind of longer running net culture initiative that also has like basically a data center for cultural servers. Vrijdagmiddagbol, VMB, is provided by Ellipsis, which is a initiative of Greenhost to support non-profit infrastructures. And skattkista is hosted. It's a physical machine which is hosted in some university, which we're keeping unnamed at this moment. Which is generously providing us with a place to stay and the bandwidth. So that's to give you an idea what Lurk is kind of doing and the things it is running. So maybe we could transition to a new slide, and I talk a bit about the next example, lumbung.space.
Yes.
So slightly bigger on the scale of that Aymeric drew out before. Lumbung.space is an experiment to create an online environment where artistic practices rooted in diversity, solidarity, and commoning can come together. The work on it started last April, so we're very early in the process. And it started as part of the ongoing Documenta 15 preparations. Lumbung.space was initiated by artist collective Roel Roscam, who is also doing the artistic direction of the Documenta 15, and it was really also a response to the kind of pandemic conditions where, suddenly the question of like, what do we do when we cannot meet in person? How do we meet online, and under what circumstances really became central. The Lumbung is the central concept of Roel Roscam's curatorial approach, which is really based on the principles of collectivity, resource building, and equal sharing. And the Lumbung refers to the Indonesian village rice barn, which is a jointly governed resource that everyone can depend on and that everybody takes care of. So for the Documenta 15, Roel Roscam has invited an international network of locally active and community-based cultural organizations and artists to work together in Kassel, which is the city where the Documenta is taking place every 5 years. And this network has groups from, for example, Palestine, Cuba, Germany, Indonesia, Denmark, Hungary, and is known in this process as the Lumbung Interlocal. And what's quite important about the Documenta 15 process is that it's not only meant to produce an exhibition, but also to build the resources, the capacity, the conversations, and the tools to strengthen and sustain this Lumbung Interlocal network and their practices, also after Documenta 15. And so the Lumbung.space is kind of an attempt to create a digital infrastructure that can support that network. It's also an attempt to find out what such an infrastructure should look like, which is really an open question. So I think in the pandemic, many of us in the cultural field have noticed, like, okay, so suddenly there's a shift online. What do we do? What is a good setup? How do we transition our practices online? And so this is really an open question. And so it's clear that different groups have started to question more and more what big tech is doing and are looking for alternatives, but it's not clear what this direction should take. And so Lumbung.space is a kind of attempt to formulate a possible trajectory from the perspective of artistic practices. And so we're kind of building an iterative prototype. So we're making kind of small steps and reflecting on it and shaping it through our use, partly because we don't know what we want and what we need and what works for our practices, but also partly because, we're like the Lumbung Interlocal is a very international community with different connection speeds and geographical context. So we also literally don't know how all of these technologies will function in those contexts. And quite important is that the process of the Lumbung.space centers discussions not only about features and what we want with the platform, but also about the sustainability and the governance, because the idea of it is that it should outlast this Documenta festival. And so we have a nice diagram to go with that as well. So because there are different wishes and requirements with what such a platform could be, Lumbung.space is really built around interconnecting existing applications. And we've set up the system in such a way that it's kind of modular and we can evaluate them and see what fits our needs and desires. And so Aymeric has made a nice scale going from public to internal. So there are three kind of core applications that we currently have on Lumbung.space. One is called the cloud.lumbung.space, which is a more traditional online office and collaboration suite, a bit like the Google Docs, you can imagine, a drop-in. Another one is tv.lumbung.space, which is a video archive and live streaming platform. And the last one is social.lumbung.space, which is the Twitter-like social network that also post.lurk uses. And all of these applications are interconnected with a single sign-in system, which we think is quite important. So that means that everybody has a single account for all of these things to access different services. And at the same time, the sign-in is, of course, very internal, but the cloud, the TV, and the social, they have different levels of, let's say, publicness. And so one of the things we are experimenting with is to have the website Lumbung.space not just be a traditional kind of website CMS, but also a kind of interface which surfaces some of the internal social dynamics that's happening in these other applications. So for example, if somebody would upload a new video to our TV or live streaming platform, it would automatically get announced on the public Lumbung.page website. And important for us is that these applications, they also kind of talk to each other, so they're again not islands. And we've built the entire system in such a way that if we find that we need or do not need particular services, we can kind of remove them or add new ones into the system. So it allows us to try different things. It allows us to ask the question in practice, let's say, not in the theory of what is an alternative, but really to try out what works for us, what kind of extra values do we get out of it, and build the thing based on that. And an important thing that we've tried to do is to keep this kind of these values of the Lumbung, or like the kind of it's a kind of idea of the commons, to have it throughout the design process. So the project does not start from scratch, but it's really incorporating existing projects which are in line with the Lumbung spirit. So they're not only free and open source software, but they'll have also kind of ways of networking to others, so to provide space for others. So, for example, the TV project, which looks like this. One of the abilities that it has is that there's multiple viewers looking at a video, that the viewers download material from each other, which makes it possible to host a video archive on limited resources. But tv.lumbung.space can also both be mirrored by another organization or mirror the videos of other organization to share resources. And we're also rebroadcasting the live stream to test out how that works. Aymeric, maybe you can go back to our diagram, and just to explain that we are really not building this from scratch. So we're relying a lot on existing projects, and we're more doing the process of integrating them together. And a lot of this work is being done in collaboration with Autonomic, which is a UK-based workers co-op who is taking care of the hosting and the maintenance of the services. So all of these elements that we have in the kind of Lumbung.space platform consist of different parts, which are existing softwares with their existing communities and existing funding models and existing modes of development. And one of the things that we're doing with Autonomic is to make these projects available for the co-op cloud, which is a kind of, it's an initiative that was started by Autonomic, which is basically generalizing the hosting of these things so that other technology nonprofits can more easily host these applications, so that they become more available, but also it decreases the costs for these alternatives. So we're really trying in our kind of research process and figuring out what do we want with alternatives. We also want to tackle that kind of practical question of how to do these things. So this project is still really much in the beginning, and we're really still figuring out what shape it will take. But at the same time, it's already resulting in more concrete discussions internally in what kind of alternatives we want. And on top of that, the work on these shared resources enables us to have these discussions and also the practical experiences of alternatives in different settings as well. So, for example, tomorrow we will do a workshop in the context of this event, where we've set up a temporary social networking server, which was possible based on the work we did on Lumbung.space. So yeah, this is what it looks like internally. Aymeric, I just wanted to say I skipped a bit of a part, so maybe I can just transition to you, to Expub.
Yes, thank you, Roel, for this smooth transition. I'm going so we've seen now two examples already. So one with LERP, which is the sort of hacker collective, trying to facilitate the infrastructure for a community of practice that is, let's say, self-servicing in a way, self-fulfilling. Another one is in the Lumbung space, which is an interesting, trying to attempt two different type of practices and relationship of working on different alternative modes of organization and production, and see how these two worlds could connect fruitfully together and at the same time feed into an ecosystem. And now for the third example, we're going to talk about art and design education with oh, this is not the right color. That's terribly wrong. So with Expub. So XPub is, I'm not going to go too much into the details of the course itself, but more, again, trying to talk about how this is a master course at the Peace Institute in Rotterdam as part of the Willem de Kooning Academy. It's a fine art and design course, but it has this sort of twist that the relationship of tool and infrastructures is really central to the course. So why is it important for us to approach it from this perspective? So to understand a little bit our position at XPub, it's very much from the perspective of trying to mess around or to change a little bit the art and design assembly line, if I can say it like this. So if we can imagine that art and design production is also a form of vertical integration in some way, from a very productive perspective, we quickly realize that art and design education hold a place that has actually quite strong and solid boundaries. And it's stuck between, let's say, question of production, apparatus or infrastructures and tools, and the other is more of, on the other side, more about what is publishing, how do you publish, how do you distribute work, what kind of market or audience you are part of. And this is not very much questioned most of the time. And here, maybe I'm going to, some people get slightly upset with what I'm going to say, but essentially this is very, very rarely discussed because somehow it just works. So by that, I mean that there is certain methods, certain workflow, certain way of working in art and design that are very much related to existing circuit of basically distribution and circulation of the work through galleries, through the exhibition, through festival and conferences. And then you also have on the other side certain tools, again, these sort of tools of the trade that come through education and that somehow are repeating through generation from generation to generation. But there is not much questioning about this thing either. So what we try to do at XPub is just not to pretend that these two elements, this one and this one, can be fully recombined and redefined entirely. That would be proper for us to say, but we just want to see like what happens if we push the boundaries a little bit. So what happens if we try to expand this sort of art and design education task, both in terms of production infrastructure tools, and then both in terms of reflecting of what kind of circuit the work is going to be evolving with. So to have a little bit of it's a bit like a sneak peek on the neighbors to see exactly like, okay, I'm part of a certain assembly line, I'm part of a certain productive apparatus in society. So what is actually really beginning before me and what is happening after me? So that's a little bit like what we're trying to do at XPub. And when we do that, it becomes quite interesting because suddenly you move on from realizing that these two different things that seems to be disconnected through the way it's approached in education are in fact, they are quite well connected. Then as soon as you start to develop your own tools, your own infrastructures, and of course you have to think about the questions of distribution, of publishing and audience, then suddenly the tool becomes more than just an object, an instrument to produce a certain commodified thing. It is also something that helps you reflect on what it is that you are doing in the first place. And this is getting quite exciting because you move to a system of where it just works to essentially transforming the position of software as tool, to simplify, to and I could even say, to make it a bit more specific, infrastructure as well. As media and culture. which is something that people who are familiar with the history of software art are going to be familiar with this argument. But it's something I think has been forgotten slightly. But by trying to explore what is going on in the boundaries of your practice, then you realize that indeed software and infrastructure is not necessarily just a tool, it's also a medium in itself, and it's also a culture. And when you do that, then something magical happens. I mean, yeah, you have to trust me with that. Don't try it at home. But something amazing happened because suddenly you realize that this whole concept here doesn't really work anymore, that you are in a much more control of what exactly you are doing and how you are defining your audience and your work and your practice. It's like unlocking slightly things that artists and designers have forgotten they are able to to handle or to engage with. Now, I'm not going to do a diagram of the infrastructure and the tools that we use at XPub, because I think we already have done quite a few diagrams tonight about network topologies. I'm just going to go through some of the services that we run in the course. So if you want to lose yourself in the different things that we are running, you can go to xpub.nl and you will see a couple of links. So these are some of the tip of the iceberg, let's say. This is sort of the most visible thing that we run. And this is all self-hosted and self-managed by the staff and the students. And one of the most important one, probably the one that is central, through which everyone is introduced at the beginning when they start to study with us, is the Wiki. So the Wiki, again, I don't want to make it very simple. If some of you are familiar with Wikipedia, maybe you might not know, you may not know, or you may not be aware that the software that runs Wikipedia is actually called MediaWiki, and it's something that you can install and run on a server, so on a machine that you own. So we basically have a similar environment as Wikipedia, to keep it simple. And this environment is just used as a wiki for the course. This is where we're going to develop the curriculum, where we're going to make public the different educational resources. But this is also a place for students to document their work. And that's the first thing that they're going to encounter with this course, to say, okay, like, how can you use this wiki, this self-hosted place, and try to make it yours to document your practice in a very mixed media way. So using screenshot, video, documentation, bits of code, all sorts of different things that you're going to be exposed through during your study with us. And this is a very, it's usually the first dip into these questions of infrastructure. The capacity to, oh wait, I can actually run my own wiki. Oh wait, I can actually use that. I can actually publish right away and document my own practice and create some sort of history. As a matter of fact, I mean, we're getting to the point where we have so much content on this wiki that we are finally, I don't know if I should say finally, but we're really reaching the point where it's getting difficult to find things, or that we actually forget that we have already made a page for certain things. And of course, you have the whole history of the past students who went through the course, who have been using it to document their work. So you start to have, it creates a very interesting institutional glue and culture around the course. Another thing that we use a lot is the pad. So Etherpad is a project that maybe some of you are familiar with. Again, something that you can self-host, which is a very simple system in which you can collectively write on a blank page, essentially, with text, but you can also add some plugin to include images and visuals. And you can type, and you will see the others logged on the same page, typing at the same time as you. So for collective session, this is very handy, to the point that we have started to adopt something that we call the pad of the day. And the pad of the day is what it is that for every day where there is a lesson or there is a workshop, a pad with the timestamp is being created. So we can use that as a sort of an accumulation of notes that are being taken collectively, collaboratively by both the staff and the students on a guest lecture, on a workshop, on a brainstorming about a certain work. And then, if necessary, this is going to be copy edited and then moved to a wiki for a more stable location. Or at least that's ideal situation. Another thing that we use also quite a lot is, as we engage with programming, is our own code repository. So essentially, to make it simple, that's a way to store and to make public source code, or let's say digital file. So there are different, let's say, repository that we use. All the students have access to it. You even have even alumni who keep on using it after graduating. It's a kind of a big resource for us to make public the more technical aspect of the course. Now things of course start to get interesting when you start to connect this with other aspects. So very briefly, for instance, this website here is essentially a collection of different Git repository. So whenever the students are working on a new publication and there is a documentation that needs to be developed or written, this is not made through, let's say, like a bunch of floating files. There is a Git repository, so a repository that store all these files, and the students can push changes to this repository, and that's automatically published. And again, this is a way, you can have. It's not different in the way of installing WordPress and having access to the backend of the system, and then have people to fill things on the CMS or something like that. But here the difference is that you are making your own backend. You are deciding, okay, I'm going to combine these different tools together to make it my own publishing workflow. And so when you start to dive into this, then things can get become a bit of a crazy ride. So recently we've been experimenting with Jupyter, which is a computational notebook that allows to essentially write and execute code in the browser, and use it also as a sort of publishing and teaching environment. So everyone has a publishing notebook, and that allows to run different, for instance, generative experiment, like on this course that was done by one of our tutor, Marita Valens. So this starts to also feed into the practice of the students. So when a new project like this one is being developed by the students, it's never just a sort of isolated single page or something that is, let's say, a top-down design. It's always informed in a sort of bottom-up way by the different tools and techniques that I've seen in the course. So, for instance, this Jupyter notebook was used to generate different visuals or different aspects of this online publication. And of course, the next step, when you start to open up basically this path, there is no end to it. So why not also connect it with a print publication? So you start to break also the boundaries of media. You start to have this sort of both this implosion and explosion of practices, where you're just starting to create your own technical or instrumental environment, and then use different type of media and format in a complementary way. Another thing, I'm checking the time, I don't want to take too much time, we got a little bit delayed, but I think that, to sum up, I think that the different type of work that come out when the students are graduating can be put into, I would say, like 4 categories. One belongs to this explosion of media that I was just mentioning, where suddenly you realize that this sort of artificial boundaries that comes from classical forms of engaging with art and design is also a parameter with which you can play with. Another level, of course, happens more on the productive aspects. So this work from Anna, she has developed her own game engine, and for a small interactive fiction on conspiracy theory. And here the takeaway is to say, like, okay, this is not an existing framework that was taken, it was just developed from scratch by her, just to fit exactly the needs of the project. And of course, another layer further is the work from Avital, who's another graduating student from this year, who has been developing an online work, which is a reflection on basically what it means to relate to your peers and to family in times of pandemic. through screens. So the whole work is a sort of it's a sort of interactive exercise in sharing a journal and different emotions attached to these times of pandemic, and at the same time a reflection on interfaces, especially in times of let's say Zoom-mediated communication. And then the last pattern I would say is what happens when you take it like radically further. And I would be like, I think the work of Mika this year is quite exemplary of this. That if you start to again open up this question of infrastructure and then to turn that into a playful media in itself, then why not stop into redefining yourself what it is your own learning environment and learning infrastructure. And in this particular text, this particular project, the challenge, the sort of radical challenge, was more to steer away from heavy audio or heavy visual environment for collaborative learning, and then to use a browser-based environment and a server environment to favor textual-based collective practices. So this is pretty much what I wanted to present with expert. Again, like this, we're only giving you like some. It's a bit of a sampler tonight. So we're going like different direction of what we can talk about when we are shifting from this question of alternative, like to make it in a way extremely playful. And if I can find again where is it? Yes, like to see these sort of different parameters that we have. This question of scale, this question of large scale, this question of systemic shift on one hand, or drop-in replacement. These are all parameters, whether you're an artist or a cultural organization, a collective, you may have different needs, and that's completely okay. The thing that the main takeaway is really to see that it's always a combination of things. There isn't like one simple magical one-click installation, one-click install button that's going to lead you to autonomy. No, this is something that you build, and you build it based on your own needs. And it's extremely, extremely rewarding. Now, there are some difficulty with that. So to conclude, I think now we're going to, we're just very much almost finished now with this presentation. We're just going to finish with what we think are, let's say, the challenges and the opportunities to be gained when we start to open up the question of alternatives in the context of the field of art and culture production. I think like one of the first challenge to address is that, and it's time to a little bit of data science, this is time, and this a level of interest, let's say, a total level of interest. The problem, I think, with the field of art and culture production is that it's at the same time our best ally and our worst enemy in this struggle. Why? Because whenever these questions appear, they tend to create a lot of interest that is followed by nothing. And then something else triggers another lot of interest, and then nothing. And then we can repeat it like this. So what we have is that we can almost time it. We could almost time it like some sort of cultural equivalent of carbon timing, in a way that maybe here we had some net art. Here we had the first interest into free, live, and open source software. Here we had social media crisis 1, and then maybe episode 2. So through time, we can see that the whole field of art and design has shown interest into this question, but it's always on a topical interest. It's always a question of discourse, a question of aesthetic, that the engagement is happening. It doesn't really make the connection with the actual infrastructure itself, that this is not a question of topic. It can be a question of topic, but we are talking about really productive apparatus and alternative modes of organization. We are not only talking about an interesting topic for a new exhibition or a new festival. So that doesn't mean that there is there are not collective and cultural organizations and even festivals who are not truly dedicated to that. But if we start to look at who is involved in these fields, these are quite, not so many people actually who have been consistently engaging with these things through time. So it's very difficult and quite frustrating in a way, because we do have an exceptional potential as artists and designers and curators and people running cultural organization or academic department. There is a lot of potential, but this potential will never be reached unless there is some sort of a practice that matches the sort of interest. One thing that is happening, however, that is very, very both interesting and let's say uplifting, is that there is throughout time has been like another level of interest going on. And this, I would say, is coming from, let's say, youth or subculture in general. Historically, youth subculture and also subcultures in general have had a very, very strong interest into micromedia or underground publishing or alternative way to basically produce work and having them distributed under their own circuit and other own platforms. And of course, naturally, as we're moving towards an increase of digital media and digital mediation in our society, then these new subcultures or existing or evolving subcultures are naturally trying to find the equivalent of what would be an underground publishing in 2021, or what would be the let's say the equivalent of a rave flyer in 2021. So where are these things happening? And of course, it's not happening into mainstream media or mainstream social media. So that's why a lot of allies are coming from this sort of youth subculture, which are creating this sort of very promising but strange mix between, let's say, existing collective of hackers and artists and this sort of new generation. And I would maybe make an hypothesis that this is probably why places like the CCC have been increasingly replacing media art festival in Europe by their cultural diversity and the sort of bold statement that they are trying to push forward in terms of alternative to mainstream culture, as opposed to engaging with, let's say, like this sort of superficial peak. Now I'm going to stop this this rant to just quickly finish with the other main challenges that are more generic. They are not so specific to the field of art and cultural production. And one is, of course, the question of choice. Like sometimes you cannot really have a choice. I think tonight we got really privileged to be working with hosts where we're willing to actually take the time and the effort to try something different. But sometimes it's not possible. There are many events that you may have gone to, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, that are using Zoom because that's the only thing they can have access to. Or maybe they have a contract with a certain organization that takes care of this, or as part of the university practices, they're going to be forced to use MS Teams or something else like this. So choice is something that, of course, is an issue. Another one is, like I said a little bit, is money and time. Money and time, we're not going to make it really easy. We don't want to make it too easy. It takes time to get into this stuff. You're not going to improvise yourself as an administrator or someone running infrastructures from one day to another or by just attending a workshop. You're going to essentially get familiar with some concept, with the language, or with some techniques that will allow you to build up later on. And that's why I think the collective dimension is very, very important, because if you go in there as an individual, you're going to have a pretty terrible experience. This is going to be pretty rough. And then, again, this question of privilege here as well is the same. Maybe you have money, but you don't have the time. Maybe you have the time, but you don't have the money. Or maybe you don't have neither of this. To contextualize again, I think that to organize this session tonight, just by using the BBB platform, which is an alternative to Zoom, it required, I think, almost, I don't think I'm lying, I think it probably reached almost 100 emails of exchanges with our host to make it happen throughout, I think, almost a year. So I'm very grateful that this has happened, but it also shows the threshold, the challenge that we are facing. Another one is, of course, this question of balance between, and a bit like this question of rabbit hole. That at some point, it's also nice to have something that works. And this is probably where the drop-in replacement is valuable in a way, because sometimes you just want to have an alternative infrastructure that is just doing that. You want to have your chat system, your email system, or your publishing environment that just work, because you may not need, you cannot always be into this sort of debugging, hacking mode all the time. Sometimes you just want things to also work. And then it's very difficult when you go there alone to find the right balance between the sort of daily use value and the potential structural change that you are aiming at. And then I think the last point is this sort of question of agency and autonomy that is relative versus absolute. Whoopla. And just to illustrate very quickly, if we go back to yes, to this, to the lurk server, for instance, this map is only the tip of the iceberg. You could easily start to say, okay, the mailing list software relies on a software that is Mailman 3. Then Varia, for instance, which is a cultural organization, or the Top Lap collective that we discussed before, are relying on the mailing list. Mailman 3 depends on Python. So, and this is, of course, has its own community of practice attached to it. So when you start to unpack this question of autonomy and agency, you start to see that this is really not an absolute position. It's more like it's both recursive and it's also fractal-like. That suddenly it expands to, with no end in sight. And that's very interesting, because on one hand, you realize that these questions of autonomy and agency is not only, it's not absolute, but it is highly relative, and it's also highly ambivalent as well. And it can backfire sometimes. So we are not autonomous when we were mailing list. And a good example was that, for instance, at some point, we used a software when Nock started, which was called Group Server. And Group Server was a project which has its own network around it, but Group Server disappeared. Or let's say that it's kind of, it entered this phase of being unmaintained forever. And as a result, it broke our mailing list system, which means that the archive of many of the groups that were hosting discussions at Lurk are not lost. They are in a database, but the software is not maintained anymore and it's not running anymore. So eventually, maybe, yes, we could write our own script and then do it, but essentially, who is going to do that? I mean, maybe if Lurk is becoming so famous that one day we get PhD students who are going to do like media archaeology on the archive of our mailing list, then maybe, yes, we're going to see this archive again. But that's not going to happen anytime soon, if ever. And if you start to look at these different elements, you have these sort of weaknesses everywhere. So the question is not whether or not these things are exceptional. They're going to happen. They're going to happen. And you have to be prepared, or you have to actually accept that this is how you relate to these infrastructures. Now, to conclude on something a little bit more positive, let's talk about the opportunities of running your own infrastructures.
Yes. So as Aymeric has shown, and as you probably know, the challenges around this type of work are definitely not insignificant. But we also think that there are some opportunities why we pursue these things, and also how particular consequences like the costs of these things can also in fact have kind of spin-off effects. So for one, I would say that the money that one spends on these types of infrastructures is not that much. in the end. It's going to be more expensive than buying an off-the-shelf Microsoft package, but it's also not crazy. And there's also amount of money that kind of what you need to spend on it becomes lower. Let's say the more others spend on it, and the better we become to make these kinds of public alternatives. And an important part of that is that whatever you spend on kind of IT resources on, for example, Microsoft, it will just exit the country you're from, go to the US, and enrich the shareholders there. And with these kinds of free and open source software ecosystems and the kind of companies that support them, spending money there is strengthening that ecosystem. That is not a given. It also requires a bit more work for that to happen, but it is a potential, and it's an important one. And it's, for example, one of the reasons why with relatively little kind of technical effort, we could be on, for example, the big blue button tonight, because it's being offered through, it's a kind of pastiche of different open source softwares that are being brought together by the big blue button company, and the money that organizations invest in it improves it, which means that other organizations can also install it themselves free of charge, which I think it's an important long-term effect. Another opportunity is also that we redefine how we relate to, for example, social media and network infrastructures. And it turns these, as Aymeric was showing, this kind of the problem of interdependency is also an enrichment of interdependency. So these relations that you have to the infrastructures you use daily, they become less one-sided. And for example, the fact that in the case of Lurk and Varia, that these organizations rely on each other, these are not just market exchanges, they're also richer exchanges. And it's also important is that in the process of doing these things, we build capacities as individuals and as organizations as well to think more and to act more on these things. Which is why certain organizations, for example, could quite quickly set up their own, let's say, the alternatives to Zoom on their own terms, whereas others were left to see what is in the market. What's also becoming clear is as soon as you start to engage with these questions, and that's maybe going back to Aymeric's first diagram of the user and the admin and the domain name and the mode of governance, is that these kind of these simple assumptions and these givens, they really start to fall apart. So, for example, if we look at the user versus admin division, which is still one which is also very prominent in, for example, free and open source software, as soon as you start engaging with these things a bit more closely, it starts to fall apart in the sense that everybody has a role to make these things work. And so it's not just enough to install some software, you actually also need to inhabit it and, let's say, exercise the alternative together. And so there's a real user power in that sense, and there's a power that one has as somebody that can be active in these alternatives to, for example, determine which networks do I enrich with the cultural output that I produce, because literally the gigantic value of Instagram and Facebook is built on what people contribute to it. So there's a political choice, especially as a cultural practitioner, to contribute that unique value to places which do not exploit you or do not put you in that kind of sharecropping bind in the first place. And that goes for larger cultural organizations as well. There's a kind of normative power of what structures do you reinforce and which ones do you not. Obviously, it became clear from the example of XPub for media designers or arts and design professionals that there's a lot to be gained in in the shaping of tools to become your own media. So it's really, rather than being kind of stuck in the sandbox of the common offerings, you can really start to shape both the tools and the conditions of your practice, which I think the Expo program shows convincingly. And finally, and that's maybe a nice screenshot to end with, and it's also really something that should not be discounted, is that these alternative tools, they can make it possible to make genuinely nice environments for each other, possibly even also safe spaces for like-minded people and peers. So I think it's one of the things that people find surprising when they use these alternative social media, is that people see real engagement and genuine interest. So of course you don't get 1,000 followers and 1,000 retweets and all the FOMO and the hype that you get on Twitter. You just get the 50 people that really care about what you're doing. And that might be enough, and that is also maybe more important in the end. So just to counterbalance a bit some of the challenges of that Aymeric introduced, I think there's also, especially in the doing of it, in the practice of it, there's also a lot to be gained there. Aymeric, I don't know if you had a exit diagram for us.
I can make one.
Make the emergency exit. So basically, yeah, this concludes a bit what we want to say. It's a lot of material, but we hope to enter a discussion with you, maybe in the Q&A now or afterwards as well. So yeah, maybe we can open the room for questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aymeric. Thanks so much, Roel, for this wonderful, inspirational diagram madness talk. Also very nice continuation after last Screenworks with Winnie soon, where we started diagramming and we got into more diagramming today. Let's maybe bring back the webcam so we can see each other. Oops. Well, I think I need to try to find my webcam, but you can go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to also thank you for the presentation, and while we remind everyone that the chat is available both here on Big Blue Button and as well on Twitch to send any questions that you might have or any comments that you might have from about the presentation. I was wondering, like, also to bring it maybe closer to our regular audience, if you could like specify or like look into the challenges that particularly images bring into these alternative networks and infrastructures. I mean, as understanding that images have like taken a much more relevant role in the last years, both not only in social media but even more now in in this zoomed life that the lockdown has brought us. And if you could like focus maybe or give a few examples of how images challenge or also give opportunities maybe to these networks.
Good question. I can start with something. I mean, if we talk about infrastructures and images, we're going to talk about, of course, especially if you're self-hosted, we're going to talk about the impact it has on the infrastructure. So there are different things that I think emerge from the fact that a lot of communities are starting to self-host, is that now you need to account for the fact that bandwidth is not infinite, storage is not infinite. So I think the strongest and more direct impact of running your self-hosted or self-managed infrastructures is that suddenly there is a direct consequences with the kind of material that you circulate. So as a result, you start to see like you have more and more environmental discourses that is also linked to these discussions happening in this network environment. That it has an impact, of course, on the question of aesthetic. It has an impact on the stuff of the idea of compression, the idea of using maybe more lower resolution environment. And also there is something that is very interesting. There is this idea that it's okay to not save everything. So a lot of, for instance, this sort of Mastodon instance, for instance, if you would look up, for instance, the photography hashtag, you would see a lot of people sharing their photographies and work in progress or technical discussion about photography. But every now and then you're going to see people who are running instances saying, I'm deleting everything after a week or a few weeks or a few months. And that's okay, because essentially, we don't need to have this sort of, or at least it's a question, do we actually need to have this sort of infinite storage or supposedly infinite storage for recording any kind of rich media or heavy media? If anything, we can see right now that all the sort of accumulation of image online are essentially serving, well, let's say machine learning purposes, where you are mostly using this material and abusing free cultural licensing to train basically algorithm from corporate infrastructures. So I think that there is suddenly these limitations allowed to connect the dots, and it has an impact on the infrastructures. I think that would be like one of the most visible element, next to the obvious question, like the obvious thing about this community of practices around a certain topic or a certain theme.
It's interesting that you. Oh, sorry, Roel, you wanted to add?
Well, I was just thinking, perhaps to add to that is that, I mean, the platforms that circulate our images now are not the platforms maybe where we uploaded these images to. So if you think about, when you made your Facebook account 10 years ago, what a different platform that was, and what a kind of different context that was, in which you also kind of consented for your material to be shared and whatnot. And so, for example, what Aymeric has mentioned with the fact that these images now become kind of the input material for machine learning algorithms and whatnot, I think it also kind of inflects on your the kind of choices that you make on in what kind of conditions do you publish something. And it can be taken for granted that on these kinds of platforms that kind of morph into different things as kind of business models shift and opportunities emerge, that it's literally, you cannot oversee what the consequence of publishing something will be, which is why a lot of people are kind of deleting archives, etc., as well on these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, also you just touched upon this idea of this free license or open source images, which were then used or appropriated by corporation or other machine learning, of course, very different purposes. And I think there's like many of these paradoxes that accompany these tensions between these closed spaces and this reclaiming of spaces. So even today, it was very interesting to see, like these difficulties for some people to join the event here on Big Blue Button, because maybe it requires maybe more literacy, or maybe it requires a more recent browser or something like that. So from one point of view, you could see as sort of less inclusive technology. On the other side, of course, like the possibilities to create more inclusive and better platform can only come from this capitalist system that offers these ways to to create more sophisticated tools and so on. I guess that how do you deal with these different paradox, or these different forms of including and excluding people? Especially, I think you did a very good job at showcasing like the complexity of all of these things, of all of these points. But one thing came up in my mind when I was listening to this is that it does require a lot of literacy, right? It does require a lot of So not just like anyone can start, although of course with the workshop tomorrow, hopefully more people will, but generally speaking, there is this barrier. Like how the question is more like, how do you see this position? How do you see yourself? How do you see the general problems with this with these tensions?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, this is it's a mess. I mean, let's be honest, it's a complete mess. But it is a sort of bricolage situation that makes it interesting as well. But it's far from being perfect. I would say, not to defend BBB or the setup of tonight, but I also remember, and I've been sitting also in different Zoom session where it was complete panic because things were not necessarily working, and there's always a sort of moment of, okay, like what are we getting into? We need to get familiar with a certain environment, specifically it's changing now from something radically different compared to what you had. That's going to be a little bit bumpy. But it's true that in general, historically, these alternatives have been very much focused on let's say, technological wonders and how to really make something innovative or clever or very idiosyncratic. And I think that we're still seeing the heritage of these practices today with a lot of these projects, in the sense that they are very much developed from the perspective of their developer, or there is very tiny communities. On the positive side, however, is that we have seen in the past 10 years a complete takeover of, let's say, issue trackers. So when you go to, let's say, if it's a free software, an open source software, let's say, that is being developed in the open, and then you have a code repository, and you go to GitHub, usually you have a place you can report bugs. So as a user, you would say, okay, this stuff does not work. If I click here, the computer crashes or the software exits, whatever. So this is historically how these technical issues have been reported. And what we've seen in the past 10 years is that these issue trackers are now being invaded, and I mean it in a good way, are being invaded by non-developer or non-technical people who are just really want to have the software that works, and are going to use this space to discuss even like political implication of the software, or changes that are problematic, or whether or not having this feature is going to be a threat for a specific community. So it is changing, and I have to say that in general, I've been quite surprised to see that the response from this sort of new generation of free software developer to include this sort of feedback into the development of the software. So this question of inclusivity and exclusivity is definitely not solved, but at least it's something, this is something talking about you've been excluded from the background.
I've been transported into this.
But what happened is that at least the issue, we don't pretend it doesn't exist. It's put on the table and it's discussed with the whole community. And that's a major difference with, let's say, like a classic proprietary closed source environment where some choices are made, but you don't really know why they're made. Necessarily, they are linked to economic situation, but not necessarily in terms of user feedback if it's not linked to a specific economic value. And so this is new. Again, I don't want to say that the problems are getting solved, but at least in these communities, the problems are really put on the table and they are discussed quite fiercely and quite openly. And that's new. I would even say that a lot of the changes that we can see in Twitter right now, in terms of, for instance, allowing the captioning of images for people who may have sight problem, is definitely a way for them to catch up with a lot of the changes that were pushed by applications like Mastodon in the first place. So now these corporations are looking at what's going on in these spaces because they see that they're going to eventually lose this battle on this question of inclusivity, I would say.
Maybe to add to that is that the question of inclusivity and exclusivity is also kind of multidimensional problem, and that it also a bit depends on the perspective where you're looking at. So, for example, one of the things that you had in the thing that happened last year, where everything had to go online, is that you had all kinds of practices, like, for example, music education that also went on Zoom. And Zoom is literally not made for this. Zoom is made for the boardroom. and it's optimized for a single speaker. It's noise canceling everything, so you cannot make music on it. And so it's actually in these alternatives then that these kinds of, let's say, more niche use cases get solved. So you have a software called Jamulus, which allows you to do exactly this on the same kind of technology, but have the kind of addresses the needs of let's say, people making music together, or maybe people even talking like this, like how you would discuss normally, you know, where you don't wait for everybody to say their thing and then move on, but people interrupt each other, etc. And so it's also a question of like who is this we, you know, which is being included and excluded with these kinds of defaults of a platform. And I think it's especially in the niches where you see that these kind of more public free and open source software based solutions, they actually work quite well as well.
Okay, so I guess that unless there's any last question from the audience, I think that we've been like asking quite a lot from our guests already. It's more like an hour and a half since we started, and if there's no further questions, I guess that we can wrap it up and leave it here. I just want to then thank you both for giving the presentation, and also thank you to everyone who has joined here in Big Blue Button, and also who has migrated to Twitch.
Yes, thank you also from my side, and also we should thank the Center for the Study of the Network Image, who's collaborated on this event. We forgot to say that at the beginning because our brains are completely boiled. I spent the whole day today with the people giving great talks with the Center of the Study of Network Image, so maybe I just forgot that I was not there anymore. And of course, tomorrow there will be the workshop again with them, so we wish you all the best with that. And I think this has been a great introduction of the things that you're going to carry out tomorrow. So thanks to everybody who joined, and then we're back again in 2 weeks on the 14th, if I remember correctly, with Emma Scheffer, aka Insta Repeat. So we're back to the dark side of the social media corporation, but with an artist who's actually going to pick apart the standardization of the travel influencer photography on Instagram. So make sure to come back to see her process and her great work. So thanks again, and have a good evening, day, wherever you are.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.